All right, welcome back for another installment of these real numbers and variables and basic operations and all of that fun stuff. In previous videos, we talked about adding and subtracting. In this video, we're going to talk all about multiplying and dividing real numbers. So when we're talking about real numbers, we're talking about numbers that either positive, finding the product of two positive numbers, finding the product of two negative numbers, or finding the product of a positive and negative numbers. And then we're going to even build on that where we're having multiple factors, some of which will be positive, some of which will be negative. And I really want to give you just sort of a basic overview of how to think about this work as we do multiplication and division. So we're going to start with multiplication. So when we think about multiplication, we want to think about the signs of the number, whether they are positive or negative. So we can know that when we multiply numbers with the same sign, the product will be positive if there are even number of numbers. And I say that because if we have three odd numbers, the product of the first two will end up being a positive, and then we have a positive times a negative, which results in a negative. So when we're thinking about multiplying real numbers, if we have two numbers, two factors, and they're both positive, the product will be positive. If we have two factors and they're both negative, then the product will be positive. Now, if we have one positive and one negative, the end result will be negative. So here we're going to examine these different factors. We have negative 75 times negative 3. At the end of the day, we know that this is going to be positive, so we can actually get rid of these signs for all intents and purposes. Now, if we're trying to skip the calculator usage, we can set this multiplication up like this. So we have 3 times 5 is 15. Put the 5 in the 1 spot, carry the 1. Then we have 3 times 7, which is 21. And since we carried this 10 up here, we have to add 1 to 21, which gives us 225. So 3 times 75 is 225. Negative 75 times negative 3 is going to be positive, so the end result is going to be positive 225. Similarly here, we have a negative times a negative. So what we'll do is we'll take 5 times 10, or 5 times 2, which gives us 10, and then 12 times 3, which is going to give us 36. Now we could actually do some simplifying here. Since these numbers are both even, we know that they're both divisible by 2, so we can divide the 10 by 2, which gives us 5, and then 36, we can also divide that by 2, which gives us 18. In theory, we could have factored out the 2 here and factored out the 2 here and just did the multiplication, but I wanted to show you a couple of ways that we could do this. So again, when you have a positive times a positive, it's a positive product, and when you have a negative times a negative, it is a positive product. Okay? Now here we have a positive or negative times a positive, which is going to result in a negative. Now we know 6 times 4 is 24, so we take the same product as if they are positive numbers and we just make it negative. Now this one you could probably do in your head, but if we needed to do it out using long division, we take the 12 times 9, 9 times 2 is 18, put the 8 in the ones place, carry the 1, 9 times 1 is 9, plus 1 is 10. Now since this is a positive times a negative and they have opposite signs, we need to make this negative 108 as well. Now, if you need to pause it, take a minute to write this down. If you don't have this in your notes yet, definitely go ahead and do that. When multiplying two numbers with different signs, the result is a negative number. Now, this is what I was talking about in that very first example, or in the very first slide. If we have 3 negatives, we first want to do the product of 2 of them. So 4 times 3 is 12, and since this is negative 4 times negative 3, the product of negative 4 and negative 3 is going to be 12. So we can rewrite this as 12 times negative 2. And if you'll notice, this 12 is positive and this negative 2 is negative. So that's going to result in a negative 24. Because 2 times 12 is 24, and a positive times a negative is a negative. So if you recall, there are 3 factors here. So if we have 3 negative factors or any number of odd negative factors, we know that the product is going to be negative. But in this case, we're going to have a set of 4 negative factors, which is an even number of factors. So we could do negative 2 times negative 2, which is 4, times negative 2 times negative 2, which is also 4, which is going to give us 4 times 4, or 16. So anytime we have an even number of negative factors, we're going to have a positive product. Anytime we have an odd number of negative factors, we're going to have a negative product. So here's that rule written out for you again. The result is always positive if there are 3 even number negative signs, and then the result is always negative if there's an odd number of negative signs. That's just something to keep in mind as you're doing this work. Okay, so multiplication is commutative. It's also associative, so the order in which you multiply things does not matter. So we have 3 times negative 1 is equivalent to negative 1 times 3. Similarly, if I did negative 3 times positive 1, that's going to equal 1 times negative 3, which is also equal to negative 3. So we can do some interesting ordering here. And then another rule that you want to keep in mind is anytime you multiply a number by 0, it's going to be a product of 0. So 4 times 0 is 0. 0 times 4 is also 0. And anytime we multiply a number by 1, it is that identity property. So anytime you multiply a number by 1, the resulting product will be that non-1 factor. And again, in the beginning of this slide, I talked about multiplication being associative. You take the 2 times 3 times 1, which is the same as 2 times 3 times 1. At the end of the day, both of these products are equal to 6. So just to recap, if we're using order of operations, we're going to perform the operation inside the parentheses first. That's where this 3 comes from, and that's where this 6 comes from. And then we multiply left to right. So we got 2 times 3 is equal to 6 times 1. Both of them are equal to 6. Okay, so division of real numbers is going to be very similar to multiplication in a sense where if we have a negative divided by a negative, it's going to be a positive. Positive divided by a positive is a positive quotient, and then a positive divided by a negative or a negative divided by a positive will be a negative quotient. Thing with this, if we're dividing by fractions or if the factors or the values that we're dividing are fractions, we're going to apply some multiplication properties. So here we've got negative 75 divided by negative 3. A negative divided by a negative is going to be a positive. So we could view this as saying 75 divided by 3. And we go in twice. 2 times 3 is 6. 7 minus 6 is 1. Bring down the 5. And we know that 13 goes into 15 5 times. Or 3 goes into 15 5 times. That's where we get the 0, 0. So the quotient of negative 75 and negative 3 is going to be positive, and it's going to net a quotient of positive 25. Now the thing to remember when we're dividing fractions is we keep the first fraction the same, we change the sign to multiplication, and then we're going to multiply by the reciprocal of the second fraction. So in this case we have negative 5 twelfths times negative 2 over 3. This can be simplified, but I'll simplify it at the end. Negative 5 times negative 2 is going to be positive 10. 12 times 3 is going to be equal to 36. And this is going to be equal to 5/18 because 2 goes into both of these. 10 divided by 2 is 5. 36 divided by 2 is 18. Now if I wanted to factor these ahead of time, I could factor out a 2 here and make that negative 1, and factor out a 2 here, or factor out 2 in the denominator and make that 6. At the end of the day, it's still going to be negative 5 times negative 1, which is positive 5, and 6 times 3, which is going to be 18. Okay, and then here we have a negative divided by a positive. Negative divided by a positive is going to be negative. 6 divided by 2 is 3, and since we have a negative divided by a positive, the quotient is going to be negative. Similarly, we have 120 divided by negative 10. 120 divided by 10 is 12, and since we have a positive divided by a negative, that's going to yield a quotient of negative 12. Okay, so when dividing numbers with two different signs, the result is going to be a negative number. Okay, here we got another situation where we have a negative and a positive. We're going to keep the numerator or the first fraction the same, and we're going to change the operation to multiplication, and then we're going to flip the other fraction on its head, which is the reciprocal. So we can do some factoring ahead of time. Since I see that there's a 2 in the denominator and 12 is even, I can divide both 12 by 2, negative 12 by 2, which gives me 6, and 2 by 2, which gives me 1. And then I'm going to have negative 6 times positive 3, which nets a product of negative 18. And 5 times 1 is going to be positive 5. Now we could write this a couple of different ways, where the negative sign is out front, or we could do 18 over negative 5. All three of these sort of orientations are going to yield the same outcome. They're all going to be negative fractions. Okay, some other things you need to take into consideration that are super important. Anytime we divide 0 by a number, the quotient is going to be equal to 0. So in other words, if we have a 0 in the denominator, in the numerator, 0 divided by 20 is 0. Anytime you divide 0 by a number, that quotient is going to be 0. But on the flip side, anytime you have a 0 in the denominator, it's going to be undefined. Because we can't break a group of 4 into 0 parts. Similarly, we can't break a group of 6 into 0 parts. So anytime we have a 0 in the denominator, or anytime we're trying to divide by 0, that quotient is going to be undefined. So take a minute and pause right now and put this in your notes, because these two rules are going to be super important, and they're things that often get mixed up. You can have a 0 in the numerator, that gives you a quotient of 0, but you cannot have a 0 in the denominator because that gives you an undefined quotient. So here we go. Negative 6 divided by 0. If we write it in fractional form, it's negative 6 over 0, which is going to be undefined. Okay? So division by 0 is undefined, and if you're doing homework, whether it's online or in paper, this is going to be the designation that you're going to want to write. You're going to want to label that particular quotient to be undefined. All right, y'all, that's it for now. Hopefully this video was helpful. Definitely comment. Let me know if you have any questions or any particular feedback, or if you have follow-up questions that I can help answer. Let's get after it, and I'm happy to help if you need anything.